Mr. Mitchell, if your daughter gets married before you hear what I recorded, you'll lose far more than your business. The woman's voice trembled so badly, I almost thought it was a prank. I glanced at the unknown number on my phone, ready to hang up, but something stopped me. 38 years in business had taught me one lesson. When fear sounds genuine, you don't ignore it. Who is this? I asked. My name is Sandra Reeves. I coordinated your daughter's engagement party 3 weeks ago. Please, don't tell Melissa, I called. And whatever you do, come alone. Those last 2 words settled in my stomach like a stone. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. Stories like this remind us that betrayal rarely comes from strangers. More often, it arrives wearing the face of someone you spent your life protecting. I looked through the glass wall of my office at Mitchell's Auto Care, the company I'd built from a tiny 2-bay garage nearly 4 decades earlier. 3 successful locations, more than 50 employees, thousands of loyal customers. Every brick had been earned through 12-hour workdays, missed vacations, and sacrifices my late wife, Margaret, and I never regretted because we believed we were building something our children would one day be proud of. My daughter Melissa was supposed to be getting married in just 6 months. I'd already spent $50,000 on the engagement celebration because I wanted her to have everything her mother would have wanted for her. Until that phone call, I believed I was one of the luckiest fathers alive. What exactly did you hear? I asked. Sandra lowered her voice even further. Not over the phone. If I tell you now, you'll think I'm crazy. But I accidentally recorded a conversation after the engagement party ended. My heartbeat slowed. A conversation between who? She hesitated just long enough to make me dread the answer. Your daughter and her fiancé. The office around me suddenly felt silent. Outside my window, mechanics continued replacing brakes, changing tires, laughing with customers, completely unaware that my world had just shifted beneath my feet. Sandra spoke again. Mr. Mitchell, I've replayed that recording dozens of times, hoping I misunderstood it. I didn't. If you hear it after the wedding, it'll be too late. She gave me the address of her office downtown and asked me to arrive at 1 o'clock. Then she ended the call before I could ask another question. I remained frozen behind my desk, staring at the framed family photograph beside my computer. Melissa stood in the center, wearing the white engagement dress she'd proudly shown me the week before. Beside her smiled Grant, the young man I had welcomed into our family without hesitation. Behind them stood my son Derek, laughing as though nothing in the world could ever separate us. Looking at that picture, I still wanted to believe Sandra had made a terrible mistake. Then my office door opened without a knock. Dad. Derek leaned casually against the doorway with a cup of coffee in one hand. Nicole and I found an amazing vacation package to Cabo. We only need about $4,000 before the discount expires next week. I looked at him for several seconds without answering. 3 years earlier, he'd moved back into my house after his marketing business collapsed. He'd promised it would only be temporary. Instead, he brought his girlfriend with him, stopped looking for steady work, and somehow, every conversation we had eventually ended with him asking me for money. Normally, I would have found an excuse to help him. This time, something felt different. We'll talk later, I said quietly. Derek frowned, shrugged his shoulders, and walked away without noticing I arrived at Sandra Reeves' office 10 minutes early, but she was already waiting in the lobby. The confident event coordinator I remembered from Melissa's engagement party was gone. In her place stood a woman who looked as though she hadn't slept much in the past 3 weeks. She shook my hand politely, glanced toward the hallway to make sure nobody was nearby, and led me into her office without wasting a single word. The room was small, lined with wedding albums, fabric samples, and framed photographs of smiling couples beginning new lives together. The setting couldn't have been more ironic. Sandra closed the door, silenced her phone, and sat across from me with a nervous expression. Mr. Mitchell, she said quietly, I've questioned myself every day since I heard this. I kept hoping I misunderstood. I didn't. She placed her phone on the desk between us. The recording was accidental. After the engagement party, I was testing the wireless microphones before packing everything away. I forgot the recorder was still running when I walked near the terrace. She hesitated one last time before pressing play. At first I heard nothing unusual. Distant music, glasses clinking, guests saying goodbye. Then Melissa's voice came through the speaker, relaxed, confident, completely different from the loving daughter I thought I knew. 6 more months, baby. That's all we need. Grant laughed softly. Once we're married, getting access to everything will be easy. My heartbeat quickened. Melissa continued. Dad already trusts us. We'll convince him selling the business is the smartest retirement decision he can make, Grant answered without hesitation. 3 million at least. Maybe more, if the buyer moves quickly. 3 million. They weren't talking about numbers on paper. They were talking about my company. The business Margaret and I had built from nothing over 38 years. My hands tightened around the arms of the chair as the recording continued. Melissa laughed. He's so trusting. $50,000 for one engagement party. Imagine how easy it'll be to get him to sell the company. I closed my eyes for a moment, hoping the next sentence would somehow explain everything away. Instead, it destroyed what little hope I had left. Grant spoke again. And once the sale is complete? Melissa answered as calmly as someone discussing weekend plans. The prenup protects everything we receive after the marriage. We get the money, then we divorce. Easy. My breathing stopped. Divorce. They weren't planning a marriage. They were planning an exit strategy. The recording became even worse. Grant chuckled. What about your brother? Melissa's response came instantly. Derek? He still thinks Dad will leave him the business one day. He's been sitting around that house for years waiting for an inheritance. Let him keep waiting. I stared at the phone in disbelief. My own daughter wasn't only betraying me. She was laughing at her own brother behind his back. Sandra quietly stopped the recording. The room became painfully silent. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she slid a folder across the desk. I made copies of everything. The original audio file, metadata, timestamps, location information, everything that proves the recording hasn't been altered. I looked at the folder but couldn't bring myself to touch it. My mind was replaying every conversation I'd had with Melissa during the past year. Every request for money. Every discussion about retirement. Every compliment Grant had given me about how hard I'd worked and how I deserved to enjoy life. None of it had been genuine. They hadn't been encouraging me to slow down. They had been preparing me to surrender everything I'd spent my life building. Sandra's voice pulled me back. There's one more thing you should know. I looked up. Grant mentioned the buyer by name after the recording ended. He already had someone waiting to purchase your company. A chill ran through my body. They hadn't created this plan recently. They had been building it long before the engagement ring ever appeared. At that moment, I realized I wasn't dealing with a bad decision or a moment of greed. I was facing a carefully planned operation that had begun months before I ever suspected my family was in danger. And for the first time in my life, I understood that protecting the people I loved might require protecting everything I owned from them. I drove home in complete silence, but I never made it inside. I parked in my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat staring at my house for nearly 20 minutes. It looked exactly the way it always had. The oak tree Margaret insisted we plant 30 years earlier still shaded the front yard. The porch swing where we drank coffee every Sunday morning still moved gently in the breeze. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside that house, however, lived a son who had forgotten how to stand on his own feet, a daughter who had quietly turned me into a retirement plan, and a future son-in-law who already had a buyer waiting for the company I'd spent almost 4 decades building. I pulled out my phone and played the recording again. This time I didn't listen like a father, searching for excuses. I listened like a businessman looking for facts. Every sentence became evidence. Every laugh became motive. Every promise became proof. By the time the recording ended, I wasn't crying anymore. I was taking notes, dates, dollar amounts, every loan I'd given Melissa over the past 2 years. The $50,000 for the engagement party, the money for Grant's investment opportunity, The credit card debt I'd quietly helped pay because Melissa insisted they were only going through a difficult period. Then I made another list. Derek, 3 years of free housing, utilities, groceries, car insurance, spending money whenever he asked. The total made my stomach tighten. I hadn't simply supported my children. I had financed their dependence. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I opened my laptop and searched for the best asset protection attorney in Houston. One name appeared repeatedly at the top of every recommendation: Victoria Chen and Associates. She specialized in protecting family businesses from inheritance disputes and financial manipulation. Her office had one appointment available the following morning at 9. I booked it immediately. The next day, I walked into a sleek downtown office, carrying nothing but a folder, my phone, and 38 years of trust that had just been shattered. Victoria greeted me with a firm handshake and invited me into a conference room overlooking the city skyline. "Tell me everything," she said. I did. I played the recording from beginning to end. I explained Melissa's engagement, Grant's interest in the business, Derek's 3 years of living under my roof without contributing a dollar, and the growing realization that I had become nothing more than a financial resource to the people I loved most. Victoria never interrupted. She simply took notes until the recording ended. Then she folded her hands together. "Mr. Mitchell," she said calmly, "the good news is they've revealed their intentions before the wedding instead of after it. That gives us options." It was the first hopeful sentence I'd heard in nearly 24 hours. She slid a legal pad toward me and began outlining a strategy. "First, we move every major asset into an irrevocable trust. Your company, your home, your investment accounts, your retirement savings. Once everything is transferred correctly, no one can pressure you into selling, manipulate future inheritance, or challenge your wishes without overwhelming legal obstacles." I looked at her carefully. "Can I still control my business?" She nodded. "Completely. You're not giving it away. You're protecting it." Then she reached for another folder. "Second, we revise your will, beneficiary designations, and estate documents immediately. Right now, your children are assuming they'll inherit by default. After today, they'll inherit only what you decide they deserve." I leaned back in my chair, feeling something I hadn't experienced since Sandra's phone call: control. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to betrayal. I was getting ahead of it. Victoria wasn't finished. She opened one final file and placed 2 official-looking envelopes on the table. "One more question," she said. "Does your son pay rent?" I almost laughed. "Not a penny. Then legally he's a long-term guest, which means you have every right to begin formal eviction proceedings." I stared at the envelopes for several long seconds. 3 years earlier, I would have done anything to keep my family together. Today, I finally understood something Margaret had tried to teach me before she died. Loving your children doesn't mean surrendering your self-respect. I picked up the pen Victoria handed me and signed every document she placed before me. By the time I walked out of her office 2 hours later, my entire future had changed. My business was protected. My life's work was beyond their reach. And inside my briefcase rested 2 sealed eviction notices that would soon force my son to face the one thing I'd spent years shielding him from: adulthood. For the next 2 weeks, I acted as though nothing had happened. I went to work every morning, attended meetings, visited my 3 repair shops, and came home at the usual time. The difference was that I had stopped making excuses for the people living under my roof. Once the recording stripped away the illusion, every ordinary day exposed another uncomfortable truth. Derek rarely left the couch before noon. His biggest concern was deciding whether to order takeout or ask me what I planned to cook for dinner. Nicole treated my house like a resort, filling online shopping carts, inviting friends over, and complaining whenever something wasn't convenient enough. Neither of them ever asked if I needed help. They only asked whether I could pay for something else. Melissa called twice during those 2 weeks. Both conversations ended exactly the same way, with another request for money connected to the wedding. I declined politely without promising anything, and each time she sounded more confused than disappointed. She wasn't used to hearing hesitation from me. Grant tried a different approach. He called simply to check in. But within minutes, he was talking about retirement, saying I had worked long enough and deserved to enjoy life while I still could. Then he casually mentioned that he knew investors who might be interested in buying Mitchell's auto care if I ever decided to sell. I thanked him for the advice, ended the call, and wrote another page of notes for Victoria. Their patience was beginning to disappear, which meant I was running out of time to stay ahead of them. 3 days later, Victoria called with the news I had been waiting for. Every document had been approved. My company, my home, my savings, and every major asset were now protected inside the trust. No one could pressure me into selling them or manipulate my estate the way Melissa and Grant had planned. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and looked at the 2 sealed eviction notices waiting inside. For several minutes, I simply stared at them. Part of me still hoped I wouldn't have to use them. Another part remembered Melissa laughing about how trusting I was. That part won. When I arrived home that evening, Derek and Nicole were sitting in the living room discussing vacation destinations they couldn't afford. I placed an envelope in front of each of them. Derek looked up. "What's this?" "Open it." He tore the envelope open without concern. Within seconds, his expression changed. "Eviction notice?" he said, staring at me. "You're throwing me out? You have 30 days to find another place to live." Nicole laughed nervously. "Very funny. I'm not joking." Derek stood so quickly that the coffee table shifted across the floor. "I'm your son, and you're 34 years old," I replied. "You've lived here for 3 years without paying rent, without contributing to this household, and without taking responsibility for your own future. That ends today." His face turned red with anger. "So that's it? You're just abandoning your own family?" I shook my head. "No, Derek. I'm stopping you from abandoning yourself." Nicole folded her arms. "Where do you expect us to go?" "The same place every other adult goes when they need a home. You find one." Derek crumpled the notice in his hand. "Melissa put you up to this, didn't she?" I looked directly into his eyes. "Your sister has nothing to do with this decision." Before he could answer, he grabbed his phone and stormed toward the hallway. I heard him dialing before he reached the stairs. "Melissa," he shouted the moment she answered. "Dad's completely lost it. He just served us eviction papers. You and Grant need to get over here tomorrow. We have to stop him before he destroys this family." I remained standing in the silent living room after he disappeared upstairs. For the first time in years, my house no longer felt controlled by the people living inside it. But I also knew tomorrow wouldn't be the end of the conflict. It would only be the moment Melissa and Grant realized their carefully planned future had begun slipping out of their hands. The next morning, Melissa and Grant arrived before 9 o'clock. Derek had clearly told them everything, because neither of them looked surprised to see my truck in the driveway. Melissa rushed through the front door first, wearing the same worried expression she had used ever since she was a little girl whenever she wanted me to forgive her before I even knew what she'd done. Grant followed a few steps behind, calm as always, carrying himself like a man who believed every problem could be negotiated. Derek and Nicole were already waiting in the living room. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward me as I walked in, carrying nothing but a manila folder. Melissa stood and opened her arms. "Dad, please, let's talk." I ignored the hug and placed the folder on the coffee table. "Sit down, all of you." My voice was calm enough that no one argued. Once they were seated, I remained standing. 3 weeks ago, I received a phone call from Sandra Reeves, the coordinator from your engagement party. Grant's confident smile faded for the first time. Melissa's fingers tightened around each other. Neither of them interrupted. I opened the folder and removed several printed pages. Sandra accidentally recorded a conversation after the party ended. Melissa immediately shook her head. "Dad, whatever this is, you'll have your chance." I pressed play on my phone. The room filled with familiar voices. 6 more months. Once we're married, we convinced Dad to sell the business. Nobody moved. He's so trusting. $3 million at least. Derek slowly turned toward his sister. Nicole's mouth fell open. Then the sentence that shattered every remaining excuse echoed through the room. "The prenup protects the money. After the sale, we divorce." I stopped the recording. The silence felt heavier than the shouting that followed. Melissa stood first. "It isn't what it sounds like." "Really?" I slid the transcript across the table. "Then explain it." She glanced down but couldn't read more than a few lines before looking away. Grant leaned forward, forcing a smile. Richard, people joke about money all the time. You're taking a private conversation completely out of context. I looked directly at him. Then explain why you already had a buyer interested in my company before you were even married. His face froze. For the first time since meeting him, he had no prepared answer. Derek grabbed the transcript from the table and read it himself. His eyes stopped at one sentence. Derek has no idea. He'll keep waiting for Dad to die. He looked at Melissa in disbelief. You said that? Melissa hesitated for only a second, but it was enough. Derek's expression changed from anger to humiliation. You were making fun of me the whole time? Derek, listen. Answer me. She couldn't. Grant finally stood. This meeting isn't helping anyone. You're right, I replied. Because it's over. I looked at Melissa. The wedding is canceled. Then I looked at Grant. And you're no longer welcome in my house. His polite mask disappeared completely. You can't make decisions like this because of one recording. No, I answered. I'm making this decision because that recording showed me exactly who you are. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're making the biggest mistake of your life. I didn't move. No, Grant. The biggest mistake of my life was believing you loved my daughter more than my business. He stared at me for several seconds before grabbing his car keys. Without another word, he walked out, slamming the front door behind him. Melissa burst into tears and started after him, but he never looked back. Derek remained frozen in his chair, still holding the transcript. I picked up the folder once more. There's one more thing all of you should know. Every eye returned to me. Yesterday, every asset I own was transferred into an irrevocable trust. My company, my house, my investments, my savings, none of them can be touched. Whatever future the two of you planned. I looked at Melissa before turning toward the front door Grant had just walked through. Ended before either of you realized the game had changed. Melissa's face drained of color. For the first time since this nightmare began, she understood the truth. She hadn't just lost my trust. She had lost everything she and Grant had spent months planning to take. I expected Melissa to disappear for a while after Grant walked out. Instead, she returned 3 days later with a new strategy. At exactly 10 o'clock on Monday morning, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Melissa stood there beside a man in a gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase. His smile was polite, professional, and completely unfamiliar. Dad, Melissa said softly, this is Dr. Andrew Patterson. He's a psychiatrist. I looked from her to the man beside her, without inviting either of them inside. Why is a psychiatrist standing on my porch? Melissa lowered her eyes as though she were struggling to hold back tears. I'm worried about you. Everything you've done these past few weeks is so unlike you. Canceling the wedding, evicting Derek, accusing Grant. I think you're under more stress than you realize. Dr. Patterson stepped forward. Mr. Mitchell, your daughter asked if I could simply have a conversation with you. Nothing formal. Sometimes major life changes can affect judgment, especially after years of business pressure. I almost laughed. Until a month earlier, Melissa had been trying to convince me I was wise enough to sell a multi-million-dollar company. Now, because I refused to finance her future, she wanted everyone to believe I was losing my mind. Doctor, I said calmly, did my daughter tell you she secretly recorded plans to persuade me into selling my company? He looked surprised. She mentioned there had been family disagreements. Did she mention that her fiancé intended to divorce her after taking the proceeds? Melissa immediately interrupted. Dad, please stop. I ignored her. Did she tell you my attorney has already documented my mental competency and witnessed every legal decision I've made during the past 2 weeks? Doctor, Patterson slowly turned toward Melissa. It was obvious this wasn't the story he had been given. Mr. Mitchell, he said carefully, perhaps this isn't an appropriate time. I agree. I opened the door wider, not to welcome them in, but to let them know the conversation was over. You should leave before my attorney considers this harassment. Melissa's face hardened the instant the doctor walked back toward his car. The concerned daughter disappeared, replaced by the woman I had heard on Sandra's recording. You're destroying this family, she whispered. No, I answered. I'm destroying your plan. She left without another word. That afternoon, Derek arrived alone. His anger from the eviction notice had faded into desperation. He found me working in the garage and stood quietly, until I finished closing the hood of an old pickup truck. "Dad, can we just talk?" I nodded but kept my distance. "I didn't know what Melissa was planning," he said. I swear. I believed he hadn't known about Grant's scheme. That didn't erase 3 years of taking advantage of me. "Whether you knew or not doesn't change anything," I replied. "You've spent years waiting for someone else to build your future." He looked down at the concrete floor. "I know. Do you?" I asked. "Because every time I tried to help you, you treated it like an obligation instead of a gift." He didn't argue. For the first time in years, he had no excuse. Before leaving, he looked back at me. "If I move out, will things ever go back to the way they were?" I shook my head slowly. "No, Derek. But they can become something better." "That depends on what you choose to do next." True. He walked away without saying another word. Watching him drive off, I realized Melissa and Grant had lost control of the situation. Their manipulation had failed. Their pressure tactics had failed. Even Derek was beginning to see the truth. But people willing to gamble millions of dollars rarely accept defeat quietly. As I locked the garage that evening, my phone vibrated with a message from Victoria Chen. "Richard, I need to see you tomorrow morning. We've discovered something about Grant's financial history that changes everything." Victoria was already waiting when I arrived at her office the following morning. Instead of the calm confidence she usually carried, she looked unusually serious. She slid a thin file across the conference table. "We ran a background investigation on Grant. After reviewing the recording," she said, "you need to see this." Inside were court filings, business registrations, and financial records stretching back almost 8 years. Grant had started 3 companies. All 3 had failed within 2 years. Each collapse followed the same pattern: large personal withdrawals, unpaid creditors, and lawsuits that quietly disappeared after settlements. None of it proved he had committed a crime, but it painted a picture I couldn't ignore. "There's more," Victoria continued. 2 women he was previously engaged to filed civil claims, accusing him of manipulating them into financing his businesses. Neither case reached trial because confidential settlements were signed. I closed the folder slowly. Melissa hadn't been marrying a successful entrepreneur. She had been marrying a man who survived by finding people willing to fund his next opportunity. This time, that opportunity had been me. That afternoon, my phone rang. Melissa. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. Her voice was barely recognizable. "Dad," she whispered. "Grant's gone." I said nothing. She continued speaking through tears. "He emptied the account we opened for the wedding. He took everything that was left and stopped answering my calls." I closed my eyes. It was exactly the ending Victoria had predicted. Once Grant realized my assets were beyond his reach, Melissa had become worthless to him. "Did he say where he was going?" I asked. "No. His apartment is empty. His office is locked. His phone goes straight to voicemail." The silence between us lasted several seconds. Finally, I spoke. "Melissa, this wasn't the first time he'd done something like this." She stopped crying. "What do you mean?" I briefly explained what Victoria had discovered. Another long silence followed. When she finally spoke again, her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "I thought he loved me," I answered honestly. "I think he loved what he believed you could give him." 2 days later, the moving truck arrived outside my house. Derek and Nicole had reached the end of their 30-day notice. They loaded boxes without saying much to each other. The confidence they once carried had disappeared, replaced by the quiet frustration of people forced to face reality for the first time in years. When everything was packed, Derek walked toward me while the movers closed the truck. "I got a job," he said. "Warehouse work. It's not much, but it's a start." I nodded. "That's more than yesterday." He managed a faint smile. "I guess you're right." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into his pocket and handed me the spare key to my house. I should have given this back a long time ago. I accepted it without saying a word. Before climbing into his car, he looked back one last time. "I don't expect you to forgive me today. I just hope someday you'll believe I'm trying." Then he drove away. That evening, I walked slowly through the house. The living room was quiet for the first time in years. No television blaring in the middle of the afternoon. No dirty dishes left on the coffee table. No arguments about money. Just silence. I expected the silence to feel lonely. Instead, it felt peaceful. For the first time since Margaret died, my home actually felt like mine again. As I stood in the kitchen making coffee, my phone buzzed once more. It was another message from Victoria. Richard, one final issue remains. Melissa has contacted my office requesting a meeting. She says she wants to tell you something she should have confessed before the engagement ever happened. I stared at the message for several seconds before locking my phone. Whatever Melissa wanted to reveal now, I had a feeling it would explain how this nightmare had truly begun. The meeting with Melissa lasted less than 30 minutes. She arrived alone, without Grant, without excuses, and without the confidence she had carried for months. She looked exhausted, as though she had aged years in a matter of weeks. After sitting across from me in Victoria Chen's office, she kept staring at the table before finally speaking. "Dad, I didn't come here to ask for money." It was the first sentence she had said to me in a long time that wasn't followed by a request. She admitted that Grant had been the one pushing every conversation about my retirement, every discussion about selling the business, every suggestion that we simplify our lives after the wedding. At first, she believed he genuinely wanted to build a future together. Then the conversations became more specific, more aggressive. Eventually, she stopped questioning them because she convinced herself everyone would benefit once I retired. By the time she realized Grant cared more about my assets than their marriage, she was already too deeply involved to admit she had made a terrible mistake. When she finished, I remained silent for several seconds. "You made one mistake," I said quietly. "You believed money could replace character." Tears filled her eyes, but this time I wasn't sure whether they came from regret or from finally facing the consequences of her own choices. Before leaving, she placed an envelope on the table. Inside was a cashier's check for $20,000. "It's all I could recover from the wedding money," she whispered. "I'll keep paying back the rest." I accepted the envelope without counting it. "Pay your debts because it's the right thing to do, Melissa, not because you think it will buy your way back into my life." She nodded once and walked away without looking back. That afternoon, Victoria confirmed every remaining legal matter had been completed. The trust was fully secured, the beneficiary changes had been recorded, and no challenge filed by Melissa or Derek could realistically succeed. For the first time in months, there were no court deadlines, no legal documents waiting to be signed, and no crisis demanding my attention. I drove to Mitchell's Auto Care instead of going home. Walking through the main shop, I realized how many talented people had carried the company alongside me for years while I focused almost entirely on my family. I promoted my operations manager, Carlos Ramirez, to oversee all 3 locations and gave him an equity stake in the business he had helped build. His eyes filled with disbelief when I handed him the paperwork. "You've earned this," I told him. "Loyalty should always be rewarded." That decision freed something inside me. For the first time in decades, I wasn't measuring every day by revenue or family drama. A week later, I accepted Sandra Reeves's invitation for coffee. We spent nearly 2 hours talking, not about betrayal, but about life after disappointment. She told me how her divorce had forced her to start over in her 40s. I told her how losing Margaret had convinced me my life was over until I discovered it was still possible to build something meaningful again. As I drove home that evening, I realized the silence inside my house no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. The home that had once been filled with demands, arguments, and expectations had become a place where I could finally hear my own thoughts again. I didn't know whether my children would ever truly change. I couldn't control that anymore. What I could control was the life waiting for me beyond their mistakes. And for the first time since Sandra's unexpected phone call, I was finally ready to live it. Nearly 3 months passed without a single phone call from Derek. For the first time in years, silence replaced constant requests for money. I stopped wondering where he was, or whether he had found another shortcut through life. If he wanted to become an adult, that journey belonged to him alone. One Friday afternoon, as I was locking my office before heading home, my phone rang. Derek's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Dad." His voice sounded different, quieter, more careful. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. What do you need, Derek? I asked. There was a long pause. Nothing. At least, not money. It was the first conversation we'd ever had that didn't begin with a financial request. I just wanted you to know I still have the warehouse job. I've been there almost 3 months. I'm renting a small apartment by myself now. I listened without interrupting. Nicole left a few weeks after we moved out, he continued. She said she wasn't interested in struggling while I figured my life out. I wasn't surprised. Relationships built on comfort rarely survive hardship. Derek took a deep breath. You were right. I spent years waiting for everyone else to solve my problems. I kept telling myself things would work out because you always stepped in. I looked out across the nearly empty parking lot. Those were words I had wanted to hear for years, but hearing them didn't erase the past. Why are you calling now? I finally asked. Because I owe you an apology. His voice cracked for the first time. Not because I want anything back. I finally understand what I put you through. Another silence followed. This one felt different. There was no manipulation hiding inside it. Only discomfort and honesty. Would you meet me for coffee? He asked quietly. Public place. 1 hour. That's all I'm asking. A year earlier, I would have invited him home before he even finished the sentence. That man no longer existed. Tomorrow morning, I replied. 9 o'clock. The cafe across from the first repair shop. Thank you, Dad. The next morning, Derek was already waiting when I arrived. He stood as I walked in, looking thinner than I remembered. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by worn work boots and a faded company jacket. His hands were rough, marked by honest labor instead of idle afternoons. We talked for nearly an hour. Not once did he ask for money, a place to live, or another chance to inherit the business. He talked about long shifts, paying rent on time, learning how difficult ordinary life actually was. Before we left, he looked directly at me. I know trust doesn't come back because someone says sorry. If I ever earn yours again, it'll take years. I nodded slowly. That's the first truly mature thing I've heard you say in a long time. He smiled faintly. We shook hands instead of hugging. It wasn't coldness. It was respect. As I watched him walk toward his truck, I realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't a single decision. It was a process built on actions repeated over time. Whether Derek completed that journey remained to be seen, but for the first time, he had finally started walking in the right direction. When I returned home that afternoon, another envelope was waiting in my mailbox. The sender's name made me stop in the driveway. Grant Holloway. After months of disappearing without a trace, he had finally decided to contact me, and I had a feeling he wasn't writing to apologize. I carried Grant's envelope into my office, but didn't open it immediately. Months earlier, I would have rushed to find answers. Now I made myself a cup of coffee, sat behind the same desk where Sandra's phone call had first changed my life, and only then unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a threat either. Grant admitted he had made poor financial decisions, claimed his relationship with Melissa had simply fallen apart under pressure, and asked if I would consider meeting him because he wanted to discuss a business opportunity that could benefit us both. I couldn't help smiling. Even after everything that had happened, he still believed I would see him as a potential partner, instead of the man who had tried to turn my family into his next investment. I folded the letter, dropped it into my shredder, and watched the pieces disappear. Some chapters don't deserve a response. They deserve an ending. A week later, Victoria called to confirm that Grant had quietly withdrawn every remaining inquiry involving my company. There would be no legal challenge, no lawsuit, and no attempt to contact the trust again. The door he had hoped to force open was permanently locked. As summer turned into autumn, life settled into a rhythm I had almost forgotten existed. Carlos successfully managed the 3 repair shops, allowing me to spend fewer hours behind a desk and more time doing things Margaret and I had always planned, but never seemed to have time for. I continued volunteering twice a week, teaching basic car maintenance to seniors so they wouldn't be taken advantage of by dishonest repair shops. Every class ended with laughter, practical lessons, and people who appreciated my time rather than expecting it. Sandra remained part of my life as well. Our occasional coffee meetings slowly became dinners, weekend walks, and long conversations about the strange ways life sometimes gives us a second beginning after taking away everything we thought mattered. Neither of us tried to replace the people we had lost. We simply enjoyed each other's company without expectations, without manipulation, and without pretending to be anyone else. Derek kept his promise too. Once a month, he called to ask if I wanted to have coffee. Sometimes I accepted, sometimes I was busy, but every conversation remained simple. He never asked for money. He never mentioned the business. Little by little, trust stopped being something he demanded and became something he quietly earned. Melissa continued sending monthly payments until every dollar she owed had been returned. Along with the final check came a short handwritten note. "I know I can't change what I did. Thank you for giving me the chance to make it right." I placed the note in a drawer without replying. Forgiveness no longer required dramatic speeches. Sometimes it simply meant allowing people to live with the consequences of their choices while giving them the opportunity to become better than they once were. One evening, I sat alone on my back porch, watching the sunset spread across the Houston sky. The same oak tree Margaret and I had planted decades earlier stretched across the yard, stronger than ever despite every storm it had survived. I realized my family had taught me one final lesson, that no amount of business success ever could. Wealth isn't measured by the size of your bank account or the value of your company. It's measured by the people who remain beside you when there's nothing left for them to take. Sandra's unexpected phone call had saved my business, but more importantly, it had saved me from spending the rest of my life confusing obligation with love. I lost the illusion of the family I thought I had, but in return, I gained something far more valuable: peace, self-respect, and the courage to protect both. Looking back, I no longer saw those painful months as the worst chapter of my life. They were the chapter that finally taught me the difference between being needed and being loved. And once I understood that difference, I was never willing to settle for anything less again.